If you can hear me, can you say hello in the chat box? That would be wonderful. Let's start this evening's safeguarding briefing. First of all, welcome everybody who's here live with me. It's really, really lovely to have you here. I run these safeguarding briefings every 6 weeks, and it's an opportunity to learn what's been going on, some of the legal updates that have been happening, and also to consider what we as safeguarding leads need to be thinking about in the coming weeks and months. So we're going to make our way through some of those issues this evening. If you do have questions, please feel free to ask if you're here live on the training, and you can do that by putting your question in the chat box where I will see it, and if I don't answer it instantly, I'll come back to it at the end and I will check through the chat box as well. I'm going to encourage you as well to be sharing your experiences if you feel comfortable to do so within the chat box. I think it's always useful with these sorts of events that we make them as participative as we possibly can. And as senior safeguarding leads, we all have a wealth of experience under our belts, and we'll have different experience of how things have been going in the past few months for us also. So please do feel free to share your experiences as we move through the training, or the update this afternoon, or rather this evening, as it's 8 o'clock in the evening. So I'm good. This is a first for me. Normally these briefings are me just talking to you, but I thought tonight, given we've had quite a few updates, I would try using some PowerPoint slides. This isn't going to be death by PowerPoint, please don't worry about that. But let's get started and see what has been going on. So, what has been happening in the last 6 to 8 weeks? Well, unless you've been living on the moon, we've been having a global pandemic. We are still utterly in the midst of this global pandemic. It's still a major incident. It's still a big issue, and it's causing all sorts of difficulties, certainly for education as well as the health service, in terms of how that is managed and the impact it's having on a wider scale as well. And we're going to look at some of that impact as we move through the briefing this evening. So in terms of what this pandemic has done, well, it's turned the world on its head. It's made things happen that we would never expect to happen, and it has caused an enormous death toll, which we really can't forget at all. So within the world of education, the world of safeguarding, lots of us, if you haven't been on the front line as a social worker, nurse, other health professional, care worker, for example, you will have been sent home or furloughed. Out of interest, anybody on the training this evening been furloughed from work, or aware of safeguarding leads who have been furloughed? Just pop that in the chat. That'd be really interesting to learn from you while you're here. We've had a number of Department for Education updates that started rolling in the early part of the pandemic. So within a week of us going into lockdown, there was guidance coming out from the DFE around working from home, around the obligations educators had in order to support students. So that talked a lot about online safety, keeping in touch with students, making sure that we were or they were being educated around how to manage and work safely online. which wasn't just things like keeping your passwords safe, but it included things like what's in your background, who are you talking to. At the early part of lockdown, we had, certainly for a number of establishments, there were concerns around whether or not one-to-one support could continue. Certainly for sixth forms and colleges, there was then some guidance by the Association of College Principals that stated one-to-ones should occur, but they should be recorded, and you should get consent in the usual way for these things to happen. It has presented an entirely new way of working for lots of professionals as well. Lots of commutes have disappeared. Lots of new technology has been embraced by professionals and students alike, and it's been a big eye-opener for lots of professionals to figure out how they balance everything. On top of all of that, if you have children at home, you will have been homeschooling or helping them work through their homework at home. Now, I know some schools have provided 8 hours of lessons. Others have sent electronic links to families. But what it has shown us is there's a huge disparity between people who have devices for everybody in the family and those families where they may be sharing a tablet or a laptop or a phone between 2 or 3 people. Huge disparity between and I've seen it in the haves and the have-nots, but also a disparity in terms of connectivity. So those in rural areas may have struggled to access online provision because their broadband system simply wasn't up to the job, or that the internet supply into a block of flats or to a particular area wasn't sufficient to cope with a sheer number of people that were working all day, every day, on a multitude of devices. What we've also seen is a complete lack of separation between work and home for the majority of remote workers. Particularly within safeguarding, lots of us will have had some sort of commute, whether it was round the corner, a 10-minute walk, or a 2-hour drive into the office. But we will have had a level of separation between what happens at work and then what happens at home. That disappeared overnight for lots of professionals. And so you were dealing with difficult situations, but from your own home. I heard the phrase yesterday that we're not working from home, we're living where we work. And I think that's probably quite apt for a lot of people in terms of how they've had to manage the current situation. And we'll look a bit later in terms of what is likely to happen in the coming weeks and months. And I would really love to hear your views on what is happening for you and how things are looking like they're going to move forward. What else has been going on? Well, sadly, but not wholly unexpectedly, there has been a significant increase in divorce inquiries. Co-op Legal Services in mid-April stated that they'd had a 42% increase in the number of inquiries since lockdown began at the end of March 2020. That isn't entirely surprising. However, what is slightly surprising is that some weeks that number has increased by 75% as a year-on-year statistic, which is enormous for year-on-year inquiries. But let's unpick this a little bit, because if we think about the key times when a family are under significant stress, one of those key times we know as child protection professionals is around holidays, such as summer holidays or Christmas time, particularly Christmas time, where families are together in an enforced way for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. It's also the middle of winter, so there's often not, and most places shut down over Christmas, so there isn't often an awful lot to do. What we've had in lockdown is that, but on an enormous scale, where families have had to stay in the same four walls. They've not been able to escape to the gym, to the shops, in any meaningful way if they're still working from home. That has been an enormous pressure cooker for families within their current living circumstances. We also know that if families are out of work, and I think for these purposes, we can look at those who've been furloughed to be in a similar position, because they'll have had a reduction or likely reduction in their pay as well. We know that workless families are 3 times as likely to have conflict within them. Now, those on furlough aren't workless, they are still earning, but they're not going to work. So you have this additional pressure cooker that is happening. And I know lawyers are bracing themselves for an increase in divorce to occur. There's also an additional reason for that, which we will look at in legal updates, because there's been a change to the divorce law this year. Finally, we can't pass without looking at the domestic abuse situation. In the first 3 weeks of lockdown, there were 16 domestic abuse related deaths. That included 2 children as well. Those are enormous figures. In June 2020, the National Domestic Abuse Helpline saw a 77% increase in the number of calls. And in the early parts of July, so this month, Refuge, Women's Aid had a 54% increase in requests for places. We saw in mid-April that there was a £28 million funding being placed for domestic abuse support. That is the tip of the iceberg. In addition to this, in the first 4 weeks of lockdown, Great Ormond Street Hospital saw a 1,493% increase in acute head traumas in children. They went from having 0.67 incidences in the year 2019 for the same period to seeing 10 acute head traumas in a 4-week period. That is an enormous increase, and it's also only the figures that we're seeing in one hospital. I haven't yet been able to ascertain the figures across the board, but if it's happening in Great Ormond Street Hospital, it will be happening in A&Es, in hospitals, in clinics up and down the country. So those figures are likely to be significantly higher. Couple that with there being significant drops to the family court in both private law and public law cases in March and April. Some of those statistical drops were as low as 21% drop in new applications. We did see an increase in June of 6% by private law applications and 8% for care cases as a year-on-year increase. But there is a huge backlog. There are a huge number of children who are subject to child protection plans, who are stuck within the system, for whom there have been no applications yet made. There are going to be a significant number made, and I'm aware that whilst there have been remote courts to deal with hearings, not every case is suitable. Not every case it is appropriate to have everybody signing in remotely. And also not everybody has the ability to log in remotely. They may not have the internet, they may not have a device that allows them to connect with the services that the local authority has. That the courts have, the court system uses. The courts, by way of information, use Skype for Business, but they have been known to use a number of other different services, but predominantly they use Skype for Business. soon to be replaced or go defunct. So it's likely if this is going to continue, they will use something like Microsoft Teams to allow people to connect. It's a mixed review, mostly positive in terms of the fact that the court has been able to continue in this way in the family arena, but some concerns about how it has happened. Now, I've worked within that system for a significant number of years, and 18 months ago, the president of the Family Law Division, Sir Andrew McFarlane, was warning that the court system wouldn't grind to a halt. It would still churn through, but practitioners, if they weren't careful, would find themselves in difficulty and find themselves in a very stressful situation as they were trying to manage the significant number of cases which were coming through. This was way before COVID-19 hit our shores. So we still have a backlog. There's a huge number of cases to come through. But I am in some ways in awe of how swiftly this giant, almost mechanical beast has been able to maneuver its services into an online platform and allow justice to continue, albeit very slowly over the last few months, to ensure that those children who did need protection were able to obtain that protection. I'm also aware anecdotally that there are an awful lot of contact orders which haven't been adhered to due to COVID-19. That may be because a parent has been shielding or has been poorly, but in some circumstances, I'm aware from legal friends, from other professionals who are working with parents and children directly, that a lot of that is simply because the parent with care found a reason why the children didn't need to go to stay with their non-resident parent. So I anticipate we're going to see an increase in those applications. We're starting to see it now with a 6% increase in private law applications. I suspect that figure will get much higher as we move through this year. Okay. So that's what's been happening over the last few months. It's not the greatest picture in the world, but it's the reality in which we are all currently living. Legally, we've had 3 big updates that have occurred, one of which is to come, which we will talk about in a moment. So, I mentioned earlier that the divorce inquiry rate has gone up by about 42%. The divorce rate will probably go up further in the coming months because the Divorce, Dissolution and Separation Act 2020 has now been enacted, and that brings in a no-fault divorce. Previously, the only way you could achieve a divorce on a relatively swift basis was for somebody to admit adultery or for the grounds of unreasonable behaviour. And it's no surprise that the majority of divorces happen on the grounds of unreasonable behaviour. But that's what's been causing a huge issue. Divorces are already acrimonious. We know that children are impacted by divorce, even where parents feel like they're shielding them and doing the best. Children are always impacted by divorce. The level to which they're impacted will vary greatly, however. But the purpose behind this particular act is to remove that level of acrimony and allow parents, couples who have simply drifted apart to separate easily and without blaming one another or one party taking the blame for the divorce. This should allow those processes to occur, hopefully in a much more harmonious, if you can ever have a truly harmonious separation, but hopefully with less impact on the children of the family. This is a really important bill for us to be aware of as child protection professionals. The Domestic Abuse Bill 2020 has been floating around since Theresa May was in power. Hopefully, it will pass its final reading in the House of Lords and become law very, very soon. It introduces three key things. It introduces that children who see, hear, or experience the effects of domestic abuse will be treated as victims. It also is going to introduce the first ever legal definition, and government definition of domestic abuse, which is going to include economic abuse and coercive or controlling behaviour. And it is also going to remove the defence of rough sex. This is a defence that has been used by perpetrators of domestic violence where a victim has been killed, and is used to mitigate the circumstances to reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter, and has been successful in doing so. This bill, should that remain, will remove that particular defence, thankfully. There are, however, some concerns with it. Unfortunately, there has been no inclusion of migrant women having access to funds to obtain a protection from a perpetrator if they're migrant and they don't have any access to public funds. There is still that problem. They still won't be able to access funds easily in order to pursue protection from their alleged perpetrator. That is something that I know there are a number of charities working with migrant and asylum seeking families to try and address. We can't pass as well without talking about the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2020. This was brought in frankly, in legal terms, a heartbeat. It was brought in April and was put before the Houses of Parliament on morning A. By the following day, it was then enacted. There was no consultation whatsoever. And crucially, what this does is remove 65 safeguards for children in care. Things like compulsory visits, things like making sure that appropriate checks are done, really serious things. And we've had a minister come out and now say that actually what they were hoping to do with this is test run it. So if this works successfully, they will scrap all of those safeguards for children in care. For any of us that have ever come across young people within the care system, we know they are some of the most vulnerable young people you could come across. And so for the government to look at removing this, and they have removed these safeguards, is really, really scary. Article 39 is a charity who have now challenged the government on their decision-making process by way of judicial review. And there has been a High Court hearing yesterday and today around that particular set of regulations. As yet, we don't know what the outcome of that is, though I anticipate we will know by the end of the week, at least some understanding of either what the High Court has decided or at least what the next steps for that are going to be. The final thing to consider is Keeping Children Safe in Education 2020. It hasn't been significantly updated. It hasn't had the consultation that it was starting to have at the early part of 2020. That consultation has been shelved for the foreseeable future. And so Keeping Children Safe in Education 2020 will come into being in the early September. There are very few updates to it, but I am running one-to-one sessions for members of the Safeguarding Association to talk through what some of those changes might be and how it will impact them in their practice. So what do we need to consider as we move through the summer and certainly ahead of the new academic year in September? Well, there are a number of things that as safeguarding professionals we must be considering. Firstly, considering that big increase in the number of divorce inquiries and the potential follow through of those inquiries to separation means that there will be more young people coming from families where parents have separated. And we know as professionals that does have an impact on young people, particularly if the separation is very acrimonious. Yes, we now have a no-fault divorce process, but that doesn't mean that the separation is going to be less than difficult for the family in any event. So be aware of the potential impact on those young people coming back to study, or maybe coming into your setting for the first time, maybe coming to use support services, also thinking about whether or not there are issues then with funding potentially for that young person, thinking particularly here around young people maybe going to university. What that also means is, as professionals, we have to make sure that our record keeping is up to date. If families have separated, we need to be sure that we've got the right information for them. Now, I know some people will do a routine check when students come back in September and consider and check that they have got all of the right information. If you know that parents were together and now you're only seeing one person's details on the form, you might want to be checking what you can share and why that's now not, why things have changed, obviously in a sensitive way. But you'll need to make sure that you're sharing information appropriately. Remember, just because somebody divorces doesn't mean that a parent loses their parental responsibility. Also, with the increase of domestic abuse, children's living arrangements could have changed completely. They may not be living with a parent at all. They may now be living with a family member. So has that person got authority to have information in relation to them? Are there orders or other local authority involvement which says information can be shared? So be really clear on your information sharing processes and protocols. Equally, contact information. Is that up to date? You can't just assume that the information you had last year is going to be current, and you can't be sure that the information, just because mum says that that's the information you can share, or that's the contact information, that that is the right contact information. So be professionally curious with these things. And if you aren't sure, ask the parent what else is there. Finally, think about court orders. Have you got copies of them? Do you know what they say? Have you got the right information on your system in relation to those particular children? So in terms of your records, that's kind of my key points for you to be considering. But the other thing that we need to think about as we move into the new academic year is how learning is going to take place. As yet, we don't have the final guidance from the government as to what is likely to happen, because we're now getting confirmation from the government that there's a second wave of COVID happening across Europe, likely to hit these shores at some point in the autumn, if not sooner. As we know, the guidance in relation to COVID has changed. What we should be doing, how we should be doing it, has changed. So as a safeguarding lead, you need to think about how are you going to fulfill your requirements and make sure everybody has the information they need at the start of the new academic year, dependent upon how you are going to start that year. Are you going to have people coming into the establishment? Are you going to be carrying on a blended learning approach? Is your facility, is your college, your school, your university big enough to have a rolling timetable? What's happening? You sit on the senior leadership team, so you should be part of those discussions and should be making sure that these safeguarding concerns are discussed as part of any plans for September and how the education process is going to continue. Also, how your services are going to resume. Maybe you're a sports facility. How is that going to work? Think about your charity situation potentially. How is all of that going to operate? Safeguarding should be absolutely at the heart of everything we do. But even more so now, it's really important that it is utterly embedded in the practices and processes that we have. So that's the end of the update. Before I open the floor for some questions, I mentioned earlier about the Safeguarding Association. It is currently about to open for enrolment. It's space where you get direct access to me. You get to ask those various questions. You get to pick my brains about some of the issues. I work with members one-to-one around safeguarding reviews. We will look at some of those processes and we will look at how the updates and the current circumstances affect you to make sure that you're legally compliant and you're compliant with all of the relevant guidance that is ongoing. If you're interested, then this is how you can join. If you want to talk to me about how I can support you and your organisation from a safeguarding perspective, then feel free to send me an email and I will more than happily, let's have a one-to-one discussion and let's see how I can best support you ahead of what is likely to be a very challenging autumn term. So I'm going to open the floor now. If you've got a question, please feel free to ask. Use the chat function. That's probably the best way to do this. So feel free to leave a question in the chat function. If indeed you have one. Does anybody have a question? Wonderful. Thank you, John. That's really kind of you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a moment. So does anybody have any questions? Oh, you're very welcome. I'm glad you found it informative and useful. When we've been in one, so Sue's asking, when we've been in one of your webinars, are we automatically invited? No, you will need to register for every briefing that comes through, but you will be alerted to the briefing either via Facebook or via my email list. It's an additional security feature that I've put in for these because they're public access. I want to make sure that they're safe for people to come on and that the links aren't shared just anywhere, which is why you've had to register again. It's just an additional safeguard for me to make sure that this is as safe as it possibly can be. So yes, you'll get an invite again about that, but you will need to register. Sue, hopefully that answers your question. It was a bit of a convoluted way of doing that. Marvelous stuff. Marvelous. Okay, thank you all very much for your attendance this evening. You will have the replay sent out to you as well, and I'll also send you the link should you want to book a one-to-one or come and join the Safeguarding Association. This is what I do week in, week out with members, and we have some great conversations, and frankly, I adore supporting people this way. So I'm really pleased you've found it useful. And I will see you later. Stay safe and enjoy your summer break. Take care.